Hello, everybody, and welcome to the end of the course. This is our last module. And in this module, we're going to kind of address the question, what if the apocalypse is not coming soon, right? We've spent this entire course talking about all the bad things that can possibly kill us all. And yes, we're all going to die eventually. But what if that's actually not coming anytime soon? And you'll see what I'm kind of talking about here, about why this is sort of an important thing to consider. Okay. Let's see. There we go. And a couple things here. In the readings that you looked at for this section, there were two. Here we go. We read a chapter of A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, where she gets into talking about what's actually happened in major disasters. And, you probably saw in that chapter that one of the things that happens is that people might think things all kind of start coming apart, but she makes the point that actually, no, people really tend to come together during the time of really big calamities. What she argues is that what causes kind of chaos, disruption, and violence usually isn't like people doing that to each other, or stealing each other's stuff, or turning to cannibalism. She argues instead that what causes a lot of these problems is the government, essentially, and other people that are used to being in control, all of a sudden feeling kind of out of control, and when regular folks just kind of start doing things for themselves and figuring out, how to distribute goods, and sometimes that also threatens the current political order. And then the other thing we read for this section, this is not the apocalypse you were looking for, gets a little more into this idea of, the current COVID-19 pandemic, and how what's called for is not necessarily, looking at things like The Walking Dead and turning into roving bands of armed survivors looking to, kill everybody else, but that instead what is really called for is greater sense of community, greater cooperation, greater compassion, and greater kind of giving aid to each other. And so one of the arguments I think that both of these things make is this idea that these catastrophes, or apocalypse, if you will, that happen are opportunities, actually, right? And it's kind of cliche to say a crisis is an opportunity, right? But that definitely comes into play when we're talking about these large types of catastrophes. And of course, when we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, you've probably noticed that everybody, and we talked about this a little in the last module, everybody from all sorts of sides of the political spectrum is using the COVID-19 pandemic as essentially an opportunity to try and make changes, right? There are people who are against government regulation who are using it as an excuse to cut government regulation. There are people that want to reform education. They're looking at this opportunity to sort of change business as usual in education. And so you've got a lot of things going on kind of simultaneously, because there's this instability in the way things usually work. And so you get these competing visions of then what to do. And so one of the things that kind of follows off of this, and I didn't make this particular short video required for this section, but it's in the PowerPoint if you want to look at it. There's this concept called the shock doctrine, which the writer Naomi Klein talks about. And basically it's this idea that after a major disaster that sort of disorients the population, that kind of gets us confused, that makes, the world a little more not as predictable, etc., that there are always people out there trying to essentially take advantage of these time periods. And her work, comes from many years ago, before the COVID-19 pandemic. But basically her major thought, or her major point in her work, is that there are organizations, people, corporations, certain people in government, etc., who are literally have plans waiting for a crisis moment to then put them in play. And the reason why some of these political actors wait for moments of crisis is because the policies they're trying to put through are so unpopular, they would never go through if we weren't kind of had our attention diverted with some other kind of major crisis. And that essentially there are people who are doing this on purpose. Or well, not doing the disaster on purpose, but taking advantage of it on purpose. And so, again, that goes to that idea that a catastrophe is an opportunity, and who takes advantage of that opportunity cannot necessarily, it could be for good or for bad. But one of the other things, going back to Solnit's work here, and also the "this is not the apocalypse you were looking for" piece, is this idea that during a disaster, people actually kind of come together. If you think about in Solnit's chapter, she talks about how people talked about these disaster times being among some of the most memorable and positive experiences they've had in their lives, because it was a time that they felt more connected to people around them. Obviously, in a pandemic, it's a little different because we're so kind of literally physically disconnected than in other sorts of disasters where people can come together and give aid to each other. But she kind of talks about these disasters being these relatively positive experiences. But there's one thing we should think about with that, which is think about how Solnit describes these disasters, like the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. She talks about that dust storm in California. But compare that to, say, the movie we watched on the earthquake in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I don't think anybody in Haiti during that time period thought of this as like one of the most greatest times of their lives when they felt connected to everybody around them. There is, I think, a critique of Solnit, which we should think about here, which is that people who experience these kinds of disasters as sort of positives where they can reconnect with people are probably coming from a position where they're already relatively well off or in relatively comfortable situations where they can withstand the electricity being off for 2 weeks or some of the other things that are going wrong, right? They're not like losing everything and having many people killed around them that are part of their families and these sort of things. And so we should take that critique keep that in mind when we think about what are the potential positives of disasters. Okay. So this really kind of cuts to the major point here of this last thing, which is what social changes tend to come from an apocalyptic disaster, right? Are disasters a chance for people to be altruistic, to challenge unjust social orders, like Solnit sort of talks about? Or if you think about it in the current pandemic, of course, you have a lot of widespread protests and a lot of energy being put into addressing long-standing issues of racial injustice in the United States, where kind of the current context is seen as an opportunity to kind of push forward for a more just social order. Or, of course, people think of these disasters as invitations to mayhem and cannibalism and just kind of craziness, or talking about Naomi Klein's work, for large corporations or other kind of wealthy actors to sort of take advantage of the situation. Well, of course, the answer is both, right? These disasters kind of have both of those sides to it. Now, who kind of comes out victorious at the end of this process, of course, is still to be seen, and that differs from place to place. And so, or both, is probably the more accurate response. But here's kind of the last point that I want to make. We've talked about all these different apocalypses, right? Absolute catastrophes. But what if it's not coming? What if we're actually going, I think every generation likes to think that they are at sort of a very, very important moment in history, that we are witnessing either the end of something or the beginning of something else, or perhaps both. But what if we're not at the end? What if a world-ending disaster is actually not going to hit during our lifetimes? What if a new beginning is not around the corner, right? At some level, that might sound nice, that we don't have to deal with a potential world-ending disaster. But there also could be a sense of depression in the idea that the problems we are dealing with today may very well be the problems we have to deal with tomorrow and the next day and the next, right? So just to sort of get us to think about this, what if we are in the middle? What if we're not at the end times? What if tomorrow we have to keep working on those same problems? And one of the people who talks about this, there's an author named Donna Haraway, and she has this concept called staying with the trouble, which is this idea that, yes, there are struggles and things that we have to do in our lives, in our communities, and in our society, and in our world. And there will be again tomorrow, right? And that we have to kind of keep working on things as a process, as if we're sort of in the middle of things, and we'll always, to some extent, be in the middle. And there's some important ramifications if we kind of give up on the idea that an apocalypse is coming soon. Now, granted, you think back to the space hazards module. At some point, an asteroid's going to hit the Earth. At some point, the sun is going to supernova or nova, and we are all going to die, right, as a species and as a planet, way in the future. So yes, we know that ending is out there. But what if an apocalyptic ending isn't coming anytime soon, right? What are the consequences of that? And last module, we talked a little bit about some of the politics of this, right? There's a lot of political movements that depend on the idea that an apocalypse is coming that's going to kind of make right, go through and get rid of all the wrong things and make things right, right? And that it's either some kind of higher political power or perhaps, a higher power in a religious sense, right? And you have these people that are kind of waiting for the storm, right, to come and sort of make a major change, right? And as talked about last module, this is true on the left and the right, right? Because the left also has this idea of, we have the revolution and then sort of everything's better at that point and moving forward. Of course, for anybody who is has studied anything about the Russian Revolution or many of these other leftist revolutions, it didn't end well, right, after those things either. And so when we're looking today about giving up this idea of the apocalypse, right? Because it's so important under so many political ideologies that at some point, maybe some other power is going to come and help us kind of clear the space. But what if help, divine or otherwise, in dealing with our problems is not coming? And so what we're left with is that idea of kind of staying with the trouble, right? In other words, the problems we're dealing with today are the problems we're going to deal with tomorrow. And also the people that are going to have to make changes are the people around us right now, right? That maybe nobody's coming in to save us or to destroy all the things that we don't like. And it's important to sort of think about that, I think, because in my opinion, after, kind of going through this entire course, there's too much emphasis today on the idea that some major event or something is going to come through and fix everything for us, or some other person is going to come and fix everything for us. And I think we need to think seriously about what the consequences are, or what is our plan if that's not happening, right? What if we do just have to live day by day for the next 70, 80, 90, 100 years? Okay, so last slide. Final points for the class. Yes, we are all going to die. Okay, that should be really clear at the end of this class. Yes, we may not all die in a big disaster. Chances are we're going to get picked off one by one from some other kinds of things, but we are all mortal. So smile, right? I mean, if you know you're going to die, and we all are, it doesn't mean you have to walk around being a jerk to everybody, but it also means that, it would be foolish to sort of live your life with the assumption that somehow that's not going to happen at the end of it, right? And I think in some respects, it's really important, to try and sort of deal with the problems we have now, because maybe no one else is coming to fix them, but also to enjoy the life you have the best you possibly can, because it is finite. And I think one of the other major points in this class is that change is natural. Change is inevitable, right? Things shift. The Earth is much more dynamic than you may have thought before you took this class. I mean, how many of you thought about gamma ray bursts could just kind of bake all of our brains at any moment? I certainly really didn't. But the change in our natural environments, in our societies, but also personally, is inevitable. Don't assume otherwise. Don't assume that the way the natural landscape is today is how it will be tomorrow. Don't assume that who you are today will be the same as you are tomorrow. Don't assume that the political structures, the political parties, the social conventions that we have today is what we're going to have in 20 years, because there's very little evidence that those things stay that stable, right? Things shift, things change, and we should expect that. And so hopefully in this class, not only do we learn about kind of those dynamic things and different ways of looking at the world, I hope that you learned a lot about also how the world functions, both in terms of the physical processes, like when we talked about earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis, and also social processes when we talk about things like why the economy is unstable, or how ideas and concepts from religion and politics sort of affect our social world. So thank you for being part of this class. And that's it for the course. Don't forget, of course, to do the discussion questions on this section. And I'll see you out there.